The dirt cracked like old porcelain. Not slowly, not gradually. It split open in long, white-edged fault lines across 40 acres of Callaway County, Missouri in the dead heat of July 1983, and if you had been standing at the edge of Earl Pruitt's south field that morning, you would have heard it. A low, dry whisper like paper tearing in a quiet room, the sound of land giving up. Earl Pruitt stood at that field's edge in his worn leather boots, the left sole held together with a strip of electrical tape he'd applied the previous November and hadn't gotten around to replacing. He was 51 years old. He'd been farming this ground for 22 of those years, and what he saw in front of him, what that cracked, pale, exhausted earth told him, was that if something didn't change, and change soon, the Pruitt farm was done. He didn't panic. Earl Pruitt wasn't built for panic. He pulled a handful of the soil from the nearest crack, rubbed it between his thick fingers, brought it to his nose, and smelled it. There was almost nothing there. That's where this story begins. Let me tell you about Callaway County, Missouri, in the summer of 1983. Sit with that place for just a moment. Callaway County sits in the heart of central Missouri, roughly 40 miles east of Jefferson City, straddling the Missouri River on its southern edge. The land there rolls in long, gentle curves, not the flat endlessness of Iowa or the hard drama of the Ozark ridgelines, but something in between. Soft hills, wide creek bottoms, timber breaks along the draws. It's the kind of country that looks easy from a car window and humbles you the moment you try to work it. In the 1980s, Callaway County was farming country in crisis. The national farm crisis that would eventually devastate rural America had already sent its early tremors through central Missouri. Land that had been selling for $3,000 an acre in 1979 was dropping toward $1,200. Farm debt was suffocating families who had borrowed at high interest rates to buy equipment and expand. The county's implement dealers, the banks on Main Street in Fulton, the county seat, and the coffee shops along Highway 54 all carried a particular kind of tension in those years. The feeling that something was ending, that a way of life passed down through 3 and 4 generations was being quietly dismantled by forces too large and too distant to fight. The summer of 1983 was also, by any measure, brutal. Temperatures in Callaway County had topped 95 degrees for 17 consecutive days by the time we reach our story. The ground was suffering from the compounded effect of 2 dry summers back to back, combined with years of conventional tillage practices that had left the topsoil thin, compacted, and nearly lifeless. You could dig down 8 inches into some of those fields and find nothing, no earthworms, no moisture, no organic matter worth speaking of. Just pale, dense clay the color of old concrete. That was the world Earl Pruitt woke up to every morning in the summer of 1983. And into that world, like a thundercloud, came the county's annual Callaway Farm Demonstration Day, held every July on the grounds of the Callaway County Fairgrounds, where implement dealers set up their machines, bankers handed out brochures, and the biggest farmers in the county gathered to show what winning looked like. It was the kind of event that could make a struggling man feel very, very small. Earl Pruitt was not a large man in the physical sense. 5'9" on a straight day, maybe 165 pounds, with hands that seemed too big for his body, the hands of someone who had been working since childhood, which he had. He'd grown up on his father's farm in the same county, the second of 4 sons, and had taken over the home place in 1961 when his father's back gave out for good. He'd married a woman named Dorothy, everyone called her, who taught 3rd grade at Mocking Elementary School and kept a kitchen garden that was the envy of the township. They had 3 children, 2 daughters who'd moved to Columbia and St. Louis respectively, and a son, Glenn, who was 23 in 1983 and helping his father full-time, which was itself a minor act of faith in a year when young men with any options were getting out of farming as fast as their pickup trucks could carry them. Earl farmed 340 acres. Not a huge operation by any standard, even by 1983 Missouri measures. He ran a 1974 John Deere 4430 tractor he'd bought used in 1977 for $18,000, financed at 11%. He grew corn and soybeans primarily, with about 60 acres of hay ground for a small cow-calf herd, 34 Angus crossbreeds that Dot had named individually, which Earl pretended to find embarrassing and secretly appreciated. The farm wasn't failing in the dramatic, overnight way some of his neighbors' farms were failing. It was failing slowly, quietly, the way a good man's health sometimes declines not in crisis but in the gradual accumulation of small defeats. Yields dropping, input costs rising, soil that seemed to need more fertilizer every year just to produce the same bushels. Earl had taken out a short-term operating loan in the spring of 1983 from First Missouri Bank in Fulton, $42,000 at 14% interest, to cover seed, chemicals, and fuel. It was the largest operating loan he'd ever taken, and when he stood at the edge of that cracked south field in July and did the math in his head, the numbers didn't work. What kept Earl Pruitt going, what distinguished him from the men who would break in those years, was something harder to quantify than yield data or debt ratios. He was curious. In an era when most farmers his age had settled into what they knew, Earl Pruitt read. He subscribed to the furrow and Missouri ruralist and successful farming, but he also read things that most of his neighbors found strange: university extension bulletins from Columbia, soil science papers from the USDA's experiment station in Beltsville, Maryland, and a thin, quietly circulated newsletter out of Salina, Kansas called the Land Report, which covered something most Missouri corn farmers in 1983 had barely heard of: regenerative soil management. He'd been thinking about it for 2 years, trying small things, watching, waiting. And by the summer of 1983, with his south field cracking open in the July heat, Earl Pruitt had arrived at a conclusion that most of the county would have found laughable. He was about to do less, on purpose. Let me introduce you to Gerald Harmon. Gerald Harmon was 44 years old in 1983, and he carried his success the way some men carry a weapon, visibly, intentionally, pointed in a direction that made others uncomfortable. He farmed 1,200 acres in the northern part of Callaway County, land his father had assembled through aggressive buying in the 1960s and which Gerald had expanded further in the late 1970s, borrowing heavily at high rates when land prices were at their peak. On paper, in the summer of 1983, Gerald Harmon was in serious financial trouble. In practice, in the coffee shop, at the co-op, at the farm demonstration day, he operated as though he were the most prosperous man in the county. He drove a 1982 GMC Sierra Classic pickup, burgundy with cream trim that still had the dealer stickers on the back window. He wore a John Deere cap with a perfectly flat brim that had never seen a day of actual field work. He was, by the reckoning of the Callaway County Farm Bureau, one of the county's progressive farmers, a term that in 1983 meant someone who embraced the newest, largest, most expensive technologies available. Gerald Harmon's pride and centerpiece, the thing he talked about more than anything else, including his wife and his children, was his new John Deere 8450 four-wheel drive tractor. The 8450, let me give you that number in context. In 1983, a new John Deere 8450 listed at approximately $89,000. It was a 350 horsepower machine, roughly 16 feet tall at the cab roof, with tires that stood 6 feet high. Gerald had purchased his with a full complement of attached implements: a 28-foot field cultivator, a 16-row planter, a toolbar that could work ground faster than anything in the county. He'd financed the whole package through John Deere credit at a rate that his banker had quietly told 2 people was going to require exceptional yields to service. Gerald didn't talk about the debt, he talked about the horsepower. At the Callaway County Fairgrounds on a hot July morning in 1983, Gerald Harmon was in his element. He stood beside his 8450, the machine freshly washed for the occasion, green paint gleaming in the Missouri sun, surrounded by a group of farmers and implement salesmen, holding court the way men like Gerald always hold court. Loud enough that everyone nearby could hear, certain enough that questions didn't seem welcome. "The future of farming," Gerald was saying, gesturing at the machine behind him the way a man gestures at a cathedral he's built, "is efficiency, horsepower per acre. Ground worked faster, planted faster, harvested faster. Anybody still running under 150 horses is already behind." He paused, smiled. "And anybody talking about not working their ground," he shook his head slowly, the way you shake your head at something genuinely pitiable. "Well, you can call that philosophy, I'll call it bankruptcy." Several men in the group laughed. Earl Pruitt, who had arrived at the fairgrounds 20 minutes earlier, heard that last part from about 30 feet away. He kept walking. The Callaway County Farm Demonstration Day had a particular rhythm to it. Morning was for walking, moving between the equipment displays, the seed company tents, the chemical company booths where men in company shirts handed out ballpoint pens and talked about pre-emergent herbicides. The noon meal was provided by the Farm Bureau Women's Committee, pulled pork sandwiches, baked beans, coleslaw, and waxed paper cups. And the afternoon brought what everyone actually came for, the panel discussion, held in a metal-sided outbuilding near the fairground's eastern edge, where the county extension agent would moderate a conversation about farming practices and the assembled wisdom of the county's leading producers would be dispensed. In 1983, that panel included Gerald Harmon. It also included Dale Whitfield, who farmed 900 acres in the southern part of the county and was known as a careful, thoughtful man. Jim Bray from the University of Missouri Extension Office in Fulton. A representative from First Missouri Bank whose name was Ted Carver, and who had the careful, measured affect of a man who knew exactly how much money most of the people in that room owed his institution. And somewhat unexpectedly, because he had not been on the original panel list, but Jim Bray had added him at the last minute, Earl Pruitt. The outbuilding held perhaps 80 farmers that afternoon. It smelled the way those buildings always smell in July: hot metal, old hay, the particular mineral smell of Missouri clay dust that had blown in through the gaps around the sliding doors. Box fans in the high windows pushed the air around without cooling it. Men in bib overalls sat in folding chairs and fanned themselves with the program sheets. Jim Bray opened the panel with a question about the county's soil conditions, specifically the deteriorating topsoil depth that the Extension Office had been measuring across multiple farms. Gerald Harmon answered first. "More fertilizer," he said simply. "You compensate for what the soil can't provide naturally. That's what technology is for. I'm putting down 240 pounds of anhydrous per acre on my corn ground. You match that with the right seed genetics, you get your yields." There were nods. This was the conventional wisdom of 1983. If the soil won't cooperate, overpower it with chemistry. Then Jim Bray turned to Earl. "Earl, you've been doing something different on your south ground this year. You want to talk about that?" Earl Pruitt leaned forward in his chair. He was aware, in the way that quiet men are often more acutely aware than loud men, that most of the people in that outbuilding were not prepared to find what he was about to say credible. He knew how it would sound. He'd rehearsed it in his own head alone on early mornings before the day began, and even to himself it sometimes sounded like something a man says when he's lost his grip on practical reality. He said it anyway. "I haven't tilled my south field this year," he said. "I've cover-cropped it cereal, rye, hairy vetch, and crimson clover seeded last September. I terminated the cover crop in May with a roller crimper I built myself, and I'm no-tilling soybeans directly into that mulch. No cultivator pass, no anhydrous, minimal herbicide. I'm letting the biology in the soil do the work." The outbuilding was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then Gerald Harmon laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was the laugh of a man who finds something genuinely, completely absurd, the kind of laugh that is also, beneath its surface, a little afraid, though Gerald Harmon would not have recognized that component in himself. "Earl," Gerald said, and there was a warmth in his voice that was not warmth at all, "you're going to let Clover grow your soybeans." More laughter from the audience. Not everyone. Dale Whitfield wasn't laughing, and Jim Bray wasn't, but enough. The particular, uncomfortable laughter of men who are relieved that the strange idea belongs to someone else. "Cover crops are for livestock operations," Gerald continued, warming to the audience now. "They're a management tool for pasture rotation. You put cover crops on row crop ground, you're fighting weeds, you're tying up nitrogen, you're losing yield. I don't know what you've been reading, Earl, but—" "The Land Report," Earl said quietly, "and some Rodale research, and a fellow named Wes Jackson down in Kansas." Gerald waved his hand dismissively. "Kansas philosophers. This is Missouri corn and bean country. You want to grow philosophy? Fine, I'll grow bushels. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone said a true thing and everyone laughed because it didn't fit what they already believed? Have you ever watched a person sit quietly while they were mocked for knowing something the room wasn't ready for?" Earl Pruitt sat quietly. He did not argue, he did not raise his voice. He said calmly that his south field would tell the story come harvest time and that anyone who wanted to come look was welcome. Gerald Harmon, leaving the outbuilding later that afternoon, told 3 separate men that Earl Pruitt had finally gone around the bend. What Earl Pruitt knew, what he had spent 2 years learning, was not, in the strictest sense, new. That's the thing about the knowledge that changes farming, it almost never is. The understanding that soil is not merely a medium for holding plant roots in place, that it is a living system of extraordinary complexity, containing more organisms in a single tablespoon than there are people on Earth, was not a discovery of the 1980s. Farmers had understood soil biology intuitively for centuries. The problem was that the post-war era had made that intuitive knowledge seem obsolete. Cheap nitrogen fertilizer, manufactured through the Haber-Bosch process, had made it possible to bypass the soil's natural nitrogen cycle entirely. Powerful herbicides had eliminated the need for crop rotations designed to break weed cycles. Larger and larger equipment had made deep tillage faster and cheaper. The result by 1983 was that American farmland, particularly in the Midwest, had lost, on average, roughly half of its original organic matter content since the 1950s. Organic matter, that's the key term. Let me make it concrete. Organic matter is the accumulated biological wealth of a functioning soil ecosystem, the decomposed residue of plant roots, earthworms, bacteria, fungi, and the invisible relationships between them. Every 1% of organic matter in a soil holds approximately 20,000 gallons of water per acre. It feeds the chemistry that converts raw minerals into plant-available nutrients. It holds soil aggregates together, creating the pore structure that allows roots to penetrate and rainfall to infiltrate rather than run off. It is, in every practical sense, the difference between soil that works and soil that merely exists. Earl Pruitt's Southfield had measured at 0.8% organic matter in a soil test he'd sent to the University of Missouri lab in 1981. 0.8%. The native prairie topsoil of central Missouri had once carried 5 to 8% organic matter. In 20 years of conventional tillage and monoculture cropping, Earl's Southfield had been stripped to a fraction of its biological potential. The solution Gerald Harmon would have prescribed and was prescribing loudly to anyone who would listen was more input, more fertilizer, more horsepower, more cultivation. Earl Pruitt had arrived at a different conclusion. The soil didn't need more violence. It needed to be left alone long enough to heal. The cover crop system he designed, cereal rye seeded at 120 pounds per acre in late September 1982, underseeded with hairy vetch at 12 pounds and crimson clover at 8, was in 1983 not a widely adopted practice in Missouri. The USDA's Soil Conservation Service had been talking about cover crops for years, but in central Missouri's corn-soybean country, the adoption rate was, by any measure, negligible. Most farmers dismissed it for the same reasons Gerald Harmon had stated: competing crops, management complexity, perceived yield drag. But Earl had read something that changed his thinking about cover crops, specifically about what happens when you terminate them at the right time and leave the residue on the surface. The roller crimper. This is where the story gets specific in a way I want you to understand, because the machine matters. Earl Pruitt could not afford a commercial roller crimper. The few that existed in 1983 were expensive, imported, and largely unavailable through Missouri dealers, so he built one. He built it in his shop over the winter of 1982-83, working from a design he'd found described in a USDA Agricultural Research Service bulletin, and modified based on his own understanding of his ground. The core of the machine was a steel drum, 48 inches in diameter and 8 feet wide, fabricated from a section of an old water tank he'd bought for $40 at a farm auction in Oxfest. He welded chevron pattern blades onto the drum's surface, flat steel strips, each about 3 inches wide, angled at roughly 15 degrees from the drum's axis. A simple frame, fabricated from 2-inch square steel tubing, connected the drum to a 3-point hitch mount so he could run it off his 4430. Total material cost, approximately $280. The principle was straightforward: rolling the cover crop at the right stage, when the rye was at anthesis, meaning full flowering in late May, would crimp the plant stems without uprooting them, killing the cover crop while leaving the residue standing and interlocked on the soil surface. That mat of dead vegetation would then act as a mulch layer, suppressing weeds without herbicide, retaining soil moisture, moderating soil temperature, and as it decomposed, feeding the soil biology from the top down. Then Earl would run his no-till drill, a 1979 John Deere 7000 planter he'd converted with aftermarket no-till coulters, directly through the mulch to plant his soybeans. No tillage, no cultivation, no anhydrous nitrogen, no mold-board plow, no disc, no field cultivator. No $89,000 tractor required. In 40 acres of cracked, exhausted Missouri clay, Earl Pruitt was betting his farm on the idea that the soil, given half a chance and the right conditions, knew how to fix itself. Let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you trusted something, a person, a process, a belief, enough to step back and let it work without interfering, without forcing it, without applying more pressure? How hard was that? How often do we confuse effort with wisdom? The soybeans emerged on June 3, 1983. Earl was out at first light. He was always out at first light, walking the south field rows when the sky above the timber break to the east was still that particular shade of deep blue that comes just before dawn burns it away. The dew was heavy. His boots soaked through in the first 50 feet, which he didn't notice because he was looking at the ground. There they were. Small, arched stems pushing up through the crimped rye mulch, each one bearing its 2 seed leaves, the cotyledons, round and pale and perfect, catching the low morning light. Not uniform, not every row equally dense, but there, alive. He counted emergence rates as he walked. Approximately 82% stand establishment, not perfect, better than he'd feared. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of test. July 1983 brought the heat we talked about at the beginning of this story. 95, 97, 98 degrees. The rainfall deficit by the end of June was nearly 4 inches below normal. Across Callaway County, soybean fields planted conventionally, the beans many of Earl's neighbors had put in on clean, tilled, bare soil began to show heat stress in the second week of July. The exposed, dark soil surface was cooking under the sun, reaching temperatures in some places that exceeded 150 degrees at the soil surface on clear days. Bean plants were closing their stomata, the leaf pores through which they breathe, by 10 in the morning to conserve water. On Earl Pruitt's south field, something different was happening. The mulch mat, the 6-inch layer of decomposing cereal rye and vetch that lay across the field's surface, was acting exactly as the research had suggested it would. Soil temperature readings that Earl took with a simple thermometer probe showed surface temperatures in his field running 20 to 25 degrees cooler than his conventionally tilled north field. Soil moisture at the 4-inch depth, measured with a tensiometer he'd borrowed from the extension office, was consistently higher in the south field. Where his north field was beginning to crack and crust, the south field's surface remained crumbly, dark, and workable. Weeds, which had been his greatest fear, the complaint Gerald Harmon had made most vehemently at the panel discussion, were largely absent. The thick mulch mat, exactly as Earl had hoped, was blocking the light that weed seeds needed to germinate. He walked the field in mid-July and counted weed pressure, perhaps 3 water hemp plants per 100 square feet and scattered velvet leaf, negligible by any standard. Without a single herbicide application beyond a light burn down of the cover crop in early May, his weed pressure was lower than in his conventionally managed fields where he'd applied pre-emergent chemistry in the spring. Glenn Pruitt, Earl's son, came to the south field on a Saturday morning in late July, the week after the county fair, and stood at the field's edge for a long time without saying anything. "Dad," he finally said, "these beans look better than the north field." Earl said nothing, he just nodded. The Northfield beans, planted into clean-tilled, fertilized ground using conventional methods, were showing interveinal chlorosis, the yellowing between the leaf veins that signals manganese deficiency in stressed, high-pH compacted soil. The Southfield beans were deep green. The canopy was closing. At 8 weeks of age, the Southfield soybeans were, by any visual measure, the healthiest crop on the Pruitt farm. Word traveled the way word travels in farming communities, through the co-op parking lot, through the grain elevator, through the bench in front of the hardware store on Main Street in Fulton. By the second week of August, Earl had received 3 requests from neighboring farmers to walk the south field. He said yes to all of them. One of the men who came to walk the field was Dale Whitfield, the careful, quiet farmer from the panel discussion who hadn't laughed. Dale walked the field rows in silence for 20 minutes. He picked up handfuls of soil from beneath the mulch mat, rubbed them between his palms, brought them close to examine the aggregate structure. He pushed his finger into the soil at several points to feel the moisture and the lack of compaction. He looked at the root systems of plants he pulled, the branching, extensive root systems that are the hallmark of soil with good biological activity and open pore structure. "How much did your system cost you per acre?" Dale asked. Earl had done the math carefully. Cover crop seed, approximately $14 per acre. Crimper fabrication, amortized over the number of acres, less than $2 per acre. Fuel savings from eliminated tillage passes, approximately $19 per acre. Anhydrous eliminated, approximately $62 per acre. Net additional cost of the cover crop system over conventional, a savings of approximately $27 per acre. He was farming the south field for less than the north field, not more, less. Dale Whitfield stood in the Missouri sun for a moment. "Earl," he said, "I want to try this on 60 acres next spring. Let me pause here and ask you something. When a system proves itself, when the evidence is standing right in front of you, how long does it take for us to overcome what we already believe? How much does it cost us, emotionally and financially, to be wrong about something we've been certain about for 20 years? The harvest came in late September. Earl Pruitt's south field, the field he had rolled crimped with a homemade drum he'd built for $280, the field he'd planted into a thick mat of dead cover crop without a single tillage pass, yielded 44 bushels of soybeans per acre. In 1983 in Callaway County, the county average soybean yield was 31 bushels per acre. The north field, conventionally managed, fertilized, tilled, yielded 33 bushels. The south field outperformed the north field by 11 bushels per acre, in a year of significant drought stress. Without expensive inputs, without large equipment, without $89,000. Earl Pruitt sat in his pickup truck at the elevator that September evening, watching the south field soybeans run across the scale, and allowed himself one small expression of private satisfaction. He called Dot from the elevator office phone. "It worked," he said. "I know," she said. She had known since July. The Callaway County Farm Bureau held a fall meeting in October 1983 at the VFW Hall in Fulton. It was a routine meeting, end-of-season reports, preview of the winter program schedule, a few items of county business. Earl had not planned to say anything about his south field. He had not, in fact, planned to do much beyond sit in the back row and drink bad coffee. But Jim Bray from the Extension office had mentioned the south field yields in his county summary, just briefly, just the numbers, 44 bushels versus a 31-bushel county average. The room had shifted. You know how a room shifts when a number lands differently than expected, not a loud change, a postural one. People straightened slightly, turned their heads. Someone near the back asked Jim Bray to repeat the number. Jim repeated it. Then someone asked whose field it was. Jim said Earl Pruitt's name. The room was quiet in a particular way. Gerald Harmon was there. He was seated 2 rows from the front in the aisle seat, the position from which he usually operated during these meetings, close enough to the front to signal authority, with room to lean out into the aisle to make comments. Earl saw his jaw tighten, saw him look at the table for a moment, then look up. Gerald did not say anything that evening. In the whole of the Farm Bureau meeting, which ran for nearly 2 hours, Gerald Harmon, who at the farm demonstration day in July had not been short of words, said almost nothing. This was notable. Several men noticed it. A few would mention it later in that careful, indirect way that farming communities address uncomfortable truths. On his way out of the VFW hall, Gerald Harmon passed Earl in the parking lot. It was a cool October night, the air carrying the first real bite of autumn, the smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Gerald stopped. The 2 men stood for a moment in the parking lot light. Gerald's Sierra Classic was parked nearby, still impressive-looking, still burgundy and cream, though Earl had heard through the county grapevine that the payments were increasingly difficult to make. 44 bushels, Gerald said finally. Yes, Earl said. In a drought year.
Yes.
Gerald Harmon looked at his own boots for a moment. When he looked up, something in his face was different from the July afternoon in the county outbuilding, something less than the performance, more than just a man.
How much did it cost you? He asked.
Earl told him the cover crop numbers, the crimper, the savings on inputs. Gerald nodded slowly. He didn't say anything more. He got in his truck and drove away. Earl watched the taillights disappear down the dark county road. He felt no victory. That's an important thing to understand about men like Earl Pruitt. They're not built for victory laps. They're built for the next season and the season after that and the quiet accumulation of knowledge that makes each one better than the last. He drove home. Dot had left the kitchen light on. The winter of 1983-84 was the busiest winter Earl Pruitt had spent in his shop in 20 years. Not fixing machinery, though there was always that, he was teaching. Word had moved faster than he'd expected. By November, the Extension Office had asked him to speak at a Callaway County soil conservation meeting. By December, he did conversations with 8 different farmers who wanted to understand what he'd done on the South Field. He brought them to the shop, spread out his soil test results on the workbench beside the welding equipment, walked them through the numbers, the organic matter readings over time, the yield comparisons, the input cost analysis. In the spring of 1984, 4 Callaway County farmers, Dale Whitfield, 2 brothers named Hoskins who farmed together near New Bloomfield, and a younger farmer named Ray Tuttle attempted cover crop and no-till systems on a combined 412 acres. They did it with Earl's guidance. They met at his kitchen table on Saturday mornings, talking through what they'd read, what the extension bulletin said, what the soil samples showed. Dot made coffee and listened from the kitchen doorway, occasionally contributing an observation that was, Earl would later say, frequently better than anything the men had said. By 1986, the number of Callaway County farmers experimenting with cover crops and reduced tillage had grown to approximately 22. The University of Missouri Extension Office, watching these early results, began incorporating Earl's farm as a demonstration site in their outreach program. Earl became, somewhat reluctantly, a speaker at regional soil conservation events, reluctantly, because he was a private man who found public speaking uncomfortable, but willingly, because he believed in what he was doing with every inch of himself. His South Field, monitored by University Extension soil scientists over the following years, showed remarkable changes. In 1981, the organic matter content had measured 0.8%. By 1986, 5 years of cover cropping and no-till management, it had risen to 1.4%. By 1991, after 8 more years, it would reach 2.1%. Small numbers that tell a large story. Each percentage point of organic matter recovered represented tens of thousands of gallons of additional water-holding capacity per acre. It represented the re-establishment of earthworm populations that had been absent from the field for years. It represented a living soil system beginning, slowly and steadily, to function as it had before the era of deep tillage stripped it bare. Yield data over the same period showed a consistent trend. The no-till cover-cropped acres yielded within 3 to 5% of conventional tillage yields in normal rainfall years and outperformed conventional acres in drought years, exactly as the logic of improved water-holding capacity predicted. Input costs declined substantially. By 1989, Earl Pruitt was spending roughly $41 less per acre on inputs for his no-till ground than for any conventional acres he still maintained. On 340 acres, that difference was meaningful. It was, in the language of the farm crisis, the difference between making it and not. The farm crisis, which destroyed roughly 1 in 3 family farms in states like Iowa and Missouri between 1982 and 1987, did not destroy the Pruitt farm. It came close. There were months, the winter of 1985-86 particularly, when the numbers were very tight and the conversations at the kitchen table were very quiet. But the reduced input costs, the improving soil, and the consistency of the no-till system gave the Pruitt farm a margin that conventional cost structure operations of the same size did not have. Glenn Pruitt stayed on the farm. He's farming it still, or he was, at the point where this story was told. He expanded the cover crop program to the entire farm acreage by 1995. He added a winter wheat rotation in the late 1990s. The organic matter on Earl's original South Field measured 3.2% in a 2001 soil test, 4 times what it had been when Earl first pulled that handful of cracked soil to his nose in the summer of 1983. And Gerald Harmon. Gerald Harmon sold his 1,200-acre farm in 1987 to a large agricultural investment company out of St. Louis. The 8450 tractor, the $89,000 machine that had gleamed in the July sun at the fairground demonstration, was repossessed in late 1986 as part of a John Deere credit collection action on the outstanding balance. He and his wife moved to Columbia, where Gerald worked for a farm equipment dealer for several years. Earl saw him occasionally at the county farm bureau events. They were always civil. Sometimes they had coffee. In 2004, at a Missouri no-till conference held in Columbia, Gerald Harmon was in the audience when Earl Pruitt, now in his early 70s, thinner, slower, but with those same oversized farmer's hands, gave a short talk about soil organic matter and the patience required to build it. After the talk, Gerald found Earl in the hallway. He shook his hand for a long time. "You were right," Gerald said. "In 1983, you were right." Earl Pruitt said the only thing he could honestly say. "I didn't know for sure," he said. "I just trusted the soil." Let me close with something that has stayed with me since I first came across the records of Earl Pruitt's farm in Callaway County. In 1983, the most technologically advanced, most expensive, most progressive approach to farming in central Missouri was the approach that was quietly and slowly destroying the very resource that farming depends on. The heavy equipment, the deep tillage, the synthetic chemistry, each of these tools was solving a problem in the short term while creating a larger problem in the long term. The soil was declining. Everybody could see the evidence, the cracks in July, the thin topsoil. The need for more fertilizer every year just to hold yields level. And the man who found a different way, who slowed down, who read carefully, who built a $280 machine instead of an $89,000 one, who trusted a biological process older than agriculture itself. That man was mocked in a hot outbuilding on a July afternoon in 1983 by a room full of men who had not yet learned what he had learned. Here is what Earl Pruitt knew that the room did not. The solution to a problem created by force is rarely more force. The solution to exhausted soil is not more inputs poured into an exhausted system. It is to step back, to cover the ground, to protect it, to feed the biology and let the biology do what it has done for 10,000 years of grassland ecology, build organic matter, cycle nutrients, hold water, and create the conditions under which living things can grow. This principle extends so far beyond farming that I hesitate to name all the places it applies. We live in an era that prizes speed, horsepower, and visible action. The man with the biggest machine gets the most respect at the demonstration day. The decision that requires patience, that asks you to do less now so that you can do more later, to invest in invisible processes that will take years to manifest, that decision is very hard to make when everyone around you is moving fast and talking loud. Earl Pruitt made it anyway. He made it because he had read carefully and thought carefully and asked the right questions about why his soil was declining, rather than simply accepting the consensus answer about how to compensate for that decline. He made it because he was willing to be the person in the room who says a true thing that the room isn't ready to hear. He made it because he had the particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, the quiet courage of a man who trusts his convictions enough to let the harvest speak for him. Let me pause here one final time and ask you something. What in your life, in your work, in your relationships, in the way you manage what you have, what in your life might be demanding more from you than it can sustainably provide? And what might happen if, instead of adding more input and more pressure to that exhausted thing, you covered it, protected it, fed it, and gave it the time to heal? Earl Pruitt passed away in February 2009 at the age of 77. Outlived him by 6 years. Glenn still farms the ground. The South Field, the 40 acres where it all began, is still in no-till production today. Its organic matter content, last measured at 3.7%, is still rising. The earthworms are there. Earl would have wanted you to know that. He counted them at the end of every spring the way other men count money. And they're still multiplying in the dark and the moisture under the mulch mat, doing work no machine can replicate, building something better than they found. That is the story of Earl Pruitt. That is the story of what patience can do to the ground beneath your feet. And the next time someone laughs at the slower, quieter, less impressive approach, remember that 44 bushels in a drought year and a room that went silent. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes.